Atlantis Revisited. Interception. Opening remarks. Hello and welcome to my channel. Chances are excellent that you found this video because you're interested in the story of Atlantis. If so, you've come to the right place. I like puzzles too, especially the old ones that everyone's had a crack at. It's obvious I'm using a teleprompter, and I hope you don't mind. I'll be interjecting my visage here and there during the presentation to keep you awake and to clarify certain points in which precision and completeness count. Having researched the topic, I could find no treatment of Plato's Atlantis that, first and foremost, takes Plato at his word, to give him the benefit of the doubt, and second, brings every detail of his writings into sharp focus, and third, recognizes each of the claims made by one or another figure in the story as an earnest observation to be made sense of on the author's terms, and last but not least, places all such claims, both individually and collectively, into the context of modern scientific knowledge. Just this once, let's suspend our disbelief and listen to what Plato wrote without second-guessing a single detail, such as why he wrote 9,000 years before Socrates instead of 10,500, whether he meant to write 900 when he actually wrote 9,000, why he wrote beyond the Pillars of Heracles when Santorini is inside the Pillars of Heracles, what he meant by the Pillars of Heracles, and so on down the ever-lengthening list of ways that modern investigators try to shoehorn what he said into their own incomplete, biased, or in some other way convenient preconceptions. My only convenience will be the words that Plato wrote, and my only criteria will be the modern facts to which they may be compared. Confirmation bias is an inherent risk in this endeavor, but at least we'll be making an effort not to bend or cherry-pick the facts to fit the story, or the story to fit the facts, or both. As we shall soon see, the story and the facts have more than enough in common without modification to pique the curiosity of inquisitive minds like ours. In order to place ancient literature into modern context, one must first place oneself into the ancient context of the authors, by systematically subtracting out of the picture each and every semblance of modern bias, modern assumptions, and modern preconceptions. This immersive approach is a habit I developed in translating Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, and have since found it an effective strategy for decoding and gaining insight into messages from the past. Now it's Plato's turn. The conventional ignorance, if you will, is that the story of Atlantis is a morality lesson on the hubris of nations. In the grand sweep of ancient literature, philosophy aside, I for my own part don't see structured morality lessons emerging until the medieval era. For me at least, the classical and pre-classical texts have always been a roller coaster ride through the worldly experiences of what we may sometimes call characters, but who are treated in context as historical figures. We have no reason a priori to second-guess this open and literal delivery style, and do err most grievously in failing to strip away the accumulated biases of the intervening ages. It stands to reason that a culture must learn to narrate its experiences before it can learn to examine them in search of morality lessons. Accordingly, we must unlearn, as Lao Tzu puts it in some translations, the habits and preconceptions we have no reason to believe the authors whose accounts we are reading had acquired, and turn the clock back all the way before entering these worlds, if we hope to understand what their occupants have conveyed to us. As far as I know, this is the first such treatment of this legend, and as far as I can tell, Plato's Atlantis is no fairy tale, nor does it stand up as a morality lesson, as we shall soon find out. any more in either case than Homer's Tales of Troy, as it turned out, when someone finally came along and applied this same general approach in a successful search for the physical ruins of Troy. We'll meet him too in short order. What surprised me the most was how quickly and easily it all fell into place on the first reading, and how drastically my conclusions differed from the conventional interpretation. How could anyone in the modern era have missed the most plausible scientific interpretation when Plato launched into the narrative on the events leading up to the destruction of this long-lost city? Either they were weak in the head and didn't make the connection between the mythological shrouding of the language and modern science, or they were weak in the knees and didn't care to confront the dire implications for the present day. There's a third failure mode in the interpretation of the Atlantis myth that I've witnessed firsthand, and which I suspect is the principal one. Before potential investigators even get to the mythology, the science, or the dire implications, their Machiavellian sensibilities raise an alarm at the word Atlantis. Before retreating from the subject and avoiding it like the plague, they impetuously slap on the fiction label to remove all doubt from those watching as to their valence on the subject. So much fantasy has grown up around this story that academics in particular have acquired an avoidance reflex and maintain a safe distance for fear of their reputations. The solution never materialized, except in fragments that were never synthesized, because the problem was never confronted steadfastly, bringing together, unperturbed, an understanding of Greek mythology, seen through the filter of 20th and 21st century scientific knowledge, starting from Plato's original account, and with the accumulation of subsequent fictional and fanciful accoutrements stripped away. In any case, I hope you enjoy my little voyage of discovery, and I hope you're sitting down. Atlantis, Part 1. Critias on Preclassical Natural Catastrophes. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. The lost city of Atlantis figures prominently in modern culture, sometimes more thoughtfully imagined, as in this image by concept artist Joan Peak Lorenz. There is, however, only one original source. It was written down by Plato circa 360 BCE in his Socratic dialogues. This investigation is guided only by that one original source, as seen through the filter of modern science. In Plato's Timaeus and Critias, Critias joins Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates on the day after Socrates presented his great treatise on governance, known today as the Republic, to share stories about nature, Timaeus, and statecraft, Critias, that promise to entertain, enrich, and inform all present. For his contribution to the symposium, Critias decides to present his account of a story, told long before this meeting, by an elderly Egyptian priest named Sonchis of Sais, to the Greek elder statesman and poet Solon, who, according to Critias, was, quote, a relative and a dear friend of my great-grandfather Dropides, end quote, based on a transcript that was still in his possession. There is a story, began the Egyptian priest to Solon, which even you, the Greeks, have preserved, that once upon a time Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Anyone in the present day with an interest in astronomy will recognize what the Egyptian priest was describing, provided we decode the mythology of his day. Helios is the Greek counterpart of the Egyptian sun god Ra, who in mythology drives his chariot across the sky each day. Astronomy buffs will clearly see in this passage a sun-like object following a non-sun-like trajectory and ending the way any meteor ends in its atmospheric passage, with a sonic boom and an explosive fireball, followed perhaps by a more widely dispersed heat pulse, as ejected and superheated spherules of molten rock rain back down into the atmosphere. The Egyptian priest himself, of all people, decodes this mythology for us. Now, this has the form of a myth, continued Sonchis, but really signifies a declination of the bodies, moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. At such times, those who live upon the mountains and in dry and lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. While modern events have yet to inform us, the Egyptian priest is simply recounting what was recorded in the archives entrusted to his keeping. We can infer based on his account that the greater thermal inertia of water in comparison to land had mitigated the effects of the airburst heat or subsequent thermal pulse of this bolide impact for those who lived near enough of it. Water, in other words, is slower to change in temperature and so acts as a damper on heat pulses in its vicinity, thus protecting those who live near enough of it from sudden extremes. What lends credibility to this account is not so much what we might presume the Egyptian priests to have known scientifically. Quite the contrary, we find credibility in the accuracy of his account on its face, despite his lack of modern astrophysical knowledge. We can thus reliably infer that something happened in the time of which he tells that is well understood today, as reported by those near enough to see it, but far enough away to be spared incineration, and high enough in altitude on that day so as not to be washed out to sea by the ensuing deluge. It would have been the spectacle of 100 lifetimes. We will find out shortly how we know that this astronomical interpretation of the Egyptian archives, though seemingly sensational on its face, is not even controversial, not scientifically and not statistically. On the contrary, astronomical observations over recent decades teach us that an account covering, think of it now, 9,000 years of human observation and record-keeping would be incomplete without stories of one or more major bolide impacts. How do we know these preclassical natural catastrophes were significant? The Egyptian priest goes on to explain to Solon why records of deluge events survived to his day in Sais at the head of the Nile Delta, but not among the Greeks. By contrast to incineration events, only the mountain shepherds survived. When, on the other hand, continued Sonchis, the gods purged the earth with a deluge of water, the survivors in your country, Greece, are herdsmen and shepherds who dwell on the mountains, but those who, like you, live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea, whereas in this land, Egypt, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason the traditions preserved here, in Egypt, are the most ancient. On close examination of this statement, we can see that the Egyptian priest has just told Solon of deluges, rainstorms from above, as opposed to tsunamis, inundations from below, so severe that they washed all Greek coastal city dwellers out to sea, leaving only, as he put it, herdsmen and shepherds who dwell on the mountains to restart Greek society. Whereas just when you and other nations are beginning to be provided with letters and the other requisites of civilized life, Sonchis continues, after the usual interval, the stream from heaven, like a pestilence, comes pouring down and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And so you have to begin all over again, like children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. In the first place, you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. For there was a time, Solon, before the great deluge of all, when the city which now is Athens was first in war and in every way the best governed of all cities, is said to have performed the noblest deeds and to have had the fairest constitution of any of which tradition tells under the face of heaven. It soon becomes evident in the Timaeus that the priest refers by the great deluge of all to the natural catastrophe circa 9,000 years before Socrates, that's 11,400 years ago, that he claims to have put an end to a putative Atlantean power, against which the armed forces of the precursor state to Athens in particular had campaigned successfully. Without citing the celestial event described by the Egyptian chronicles as the cause of anything beyond what they further describe as one of the great destructions of mankind, it should be noted that if their timeline is accurate, then it fits rather precisely modern estimates for the onset of the Younger Dryas Meltwater Pulse 1b, shown on this chart as having occurred 11,400 years before the present. Let's recap. In the absence of direct modern experience, we should expect several major immediate consequences of bolide impacts, not necessarily all of which occur in each case, but precisely all of which are mentioned by Sonchis in association with, as Plato writes, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. Heat pulses, as we would expect during atmospheric passage or in the ensuing fallout of superheated spherules of molten rock. Earthquakes, as triggered by the enormous kinetic energy of impact. Tsunamis, as triggered by oceanic or coastal impacts or by earthquakes. And deluges, a single day or night of excessive rain, as was recounted in Plato's writings, to have washed clean of topsoil the land masses and islands surrounding preclassical Athens. The last of these, deluges, would result from the secondary fallout of moisture from an atmosphere suddenly supersaturated by an oceanic or ice pack impact. Because about 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, we should expect 70% of major bolide impacts to displace, vaporize, and eject a vast amount of seawater that would supersaturate the atmosphere, leading to a protracted deluge after the excess vapor cooled and condensed back out as precipitation. According to the Egyptian priest, the Greek islands lost topsoil to deluges, not just once, but several times, over the thousands of years covered by the Egyptian records. Atlantis, Part 2, Critias' Trail of Clues. We've been through this before with a dilettante German archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. Proceeding methodically, in calm defiance of the widespread belief in his time that Homer's Iliad is a work of fiction, Schliemann followed its every clue to the location of the lost city of Troy. 9 levels of successive building and destruction would eventually be excavated at the site he located, illustrating the strategic and economic importance through the lost ages of this metropolitan tollbooth of Black Sea commerce. More to the present point, Schliemann's discovery demonstrated the practical value of classical texts and lent credence to the earnest intent of their authors. Mythology and religion aside, hoaxes and viral memes are elements of our time, but not theirs. We should not confuse the two. Projecting backward in time, the example of those who find distraction and excitement in perpetrating malicious fiction today, most of whom are barely literate, we would expect that in Plato's time they would not have been literate at all. Consider the more realistic presupposition that to ancient authors of Plato's caliber, the novel prospect of accurately communicating past events to future generations that the advent of written language afforded them, in a world yet saddled with illiteracy and with geographical and technological barriers to communication, would have been distraction and excitement enough. With Plato's Atlantis, we're back at square one. Academic after academic, some entrenched and some self-appointed, line up to profess their skepticism, trusting in the venerated process by which so many have sealed their reputations as immovable pillars of modern material reductionism. The legend of Troy, we now know, is a factual tale of bloodshed, banditry, and looting, reworked by modern academics into an epic honor quest dedicated to the rescue and repatriation of Helen, and to vengeance on her kidnappers. In the actual text of the legend as recorded by Homer in his Iliad, the Queen of Sparta was simply the pretext for the Trojan raid and 10-year siege of a fortress on the Hellespont, the bottleneck of a vital trade route, with the power to charge arbitrary tolls for passage to and from the Black Sea region. The bulk of the material was gratuitous violence and adventurism, pulp reality for a long-settled agrarian audience who, for all of the story's countless retellings in the grand oral tradition leading up to its first written versions, can only have been bored and hungry for what Homer delivered in droves. Similarly, based on the evidence we shall soon consider, the legend of Atlantis is a lightly fragmented but earnestly told historical account that modern academics have reworked into a morality lesson for the vanquished opponents of Athens, whose ideology forms the basis of modern democracies the world over. Today more than ever, there are political points to be won by vaunting the statecraft and martial prowess of ancient Athens. Whether it was Athenian military might or the power of nature that did the vanquishing of the Atlanteans is a different question that we can safely set aside from this investigation. We will also stumble onto a sticking point around which Plato's Atlantis breaks down as a morality lesson. Plato had no plausible reason to lie to us about Atlantis any more than had Homer before him about Troy. It was Plato, let's not forget, who established the academy that would forge the mind of Aristotle, the founder of the modern scientific thinking the skeptics would have us believe they so stubbornly defend in dismissing Plato's Atlantis as a work of fiction. A major, once-in-100 lifetimes bolide impact appears to be what Critias was describing when he told Socrates and his gathering of fellow philosophers of, quote, a story which even you, the Greeks, have preserved, that once upon a time Peathon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. In modern terms, it's a much simpler and better understood story of a sun-like object following a non-sun-like trajectory, ending in an explosive fireball. The likelihood of an ancient fictional account coinciding so closely with the modern description of a bolide event is infinitesimal. Infinitesimal, therefore, is much closer than 100% to the likelihood that modern Atlantis skeptics are correct in doubting it. Turning now from a qualitative analysis of the story to the often powerful and telling quantitative world of statistics, the only real absurdity in our interpretation of Critias is becoming increasingly evident in light of the frequent near misses, both reported and projected, of near-Earth objects in the modern era. Against the gathering backdrop of this data, the real absurdity is the possibility that there were no bolide impacts worth writing about over the 9,000 years covered by his remarks to those present at Socrates' gathering. Skepticism is healthy until it begins to collide with statistical preponderances like this one, at which point it begins to stand in the way of science. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, continues Critias at Socrates' symposium, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. And during all this time and through so many changes, there has never been any considerable accumulation of the soil coming down from the mountains, as in other places, but the earth has fallen away all round and sunk out of sight. Major bolide impacts over the 9,000 years from Atlantis to Socrates. Likely or unlikely? The biblical flood, by way of example, is now thought to have been caused by a bolide impact in the Indian Ocean around 3000 to 2800 BC, creating the 30-kilometer, that's 19 miles wide, undersea Burckle crater, and generating a giant tsunami that flooded the surrounding coastal lands. Within a few days, a protracted and possibly worldwide deluge would have followed, as the atmospheric vapor from the massive burst of seawater thus ejected eventually cooled and precipitated back out as excessive rain. Perhaps this comparatively recent impact event is what Sonchis of Sais referred to as the Great Destruction of Deucalion, in recounting the natural catastrophes of the past 9,000 years, to the Athenian statesman Solon. According to the authors of the 2007 paper on the Burckle Abyssal Impact Crater, quote, an oceanic impact of this size could vaporize millions of tons of seawater that would take days to cool enough to produce rain. During the time that the water was cooling, global winds would transport the clouds thousands of kilometers. Thus, an impact of this size could be the source of deluge legends in the continents that circle the Indian Ocean: Africa, Australia, Europe, and Asia. Here are the near-Earth asteroids as of January 1st, 1999. And here's the dataset 10 years later. And 9 years after that. And finally, all the known asteroids as of 2018, including those known to swing by our planet. The growing list of near-Earth objects most likely does not include most of the comparatively short-period comets swooping in like clockwork at intervals ranging up to every 200 years from the Kuiper Belt, a realm of icy objects immediately surrounding the solar system. Nor does it include the long-period comets, making surprise visits from the much more distant Oort cloud, at intervals ranging from every 200 up to every 30 million years, after long intervals, and after the usual interval, as Sonchis of Sais put it. Over the course of the 9,000 years covered by his remarks, about 45 long-period comets and untold hundreds of short-period comets could have swung by Earth. How many of those hundreds of comets should we add to the much larger list of near-Earth objects that may have impacted the Earth in all that time? So let's ask ourselves again. Major bolide impacts over the 9,000 years from Atlantis to Socrates, likely or unlikely? The more realistic terms based on the latest scientific evidence are statistically inevitable, and how many? For whatever it's worth, to this we can add Sonchis' remark that many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years. Do we remember from Part 1 what causes these catastrophic deluges? Are we more inclined to believe Sonchis now? He lacked modern scientific knowledge, but we lack the experience of the ages that he and Solon and Critias and Plato have graciously conveyed to us. And let me tell you, if it's not already clear, Sonchis' experience of the ages sorts all too well with modern scientific knowledge. The consequence is that in comparison of what then was, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, as in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. Lest we fail to appreciate the magnitude of the natural catastrophe that Critias claims to have brought an end to the Atlantean civilization, here is his description of the effects on Athens of the same or a similar event. Now the city, Athens, in those days, was arranged on this wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now. For the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the same time there were earthquakes, and then occurred the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. The Pillars of Heracles were defined as clearly in Critias' time as they are today, as those rising over the straits separating the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, recounts Sonchis in Plato's Critias, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Thus, while the location of Plato's Atlantis may be controversial, it cannot be Thera, modern-day Santorini, nor can it be the Minoan palatial complex at Knossos on Crete, nor can it be any other place within the Straits of Heracles. If there is such a place that people choose to call Atlantis, then so be it. It's their own invention, and not Plato's Atlantis. Thus, having established the severity of the deluge that destroyed Atlantis, and of the numerous deluges that deprived the Greek islands of much of their fertile soil down through the ages according to Sonchis, what sort of natural catastrophe could have caused such widespread destruction? Based on a rudimentary appreciation of modern astronomy and astrophysics, when brought to bear on Plato's account, and now, moreover, on our review of the discovery and analysis of the Berkel abyssal crater, and of the evidence of the geographically widespread effects of the impact that produced it, and on the preponderance of the applicable modern statistical parameters of our celestial neighborhood, I think that the least biased and most courageous viewers have already been convinced of the answer to this question. A single night of excessive rain. Earthquakes. The extraordinary inundation. While it is tempting to place one of the deluges purportedly experienced by Athens contemporaneous with the destruction of Atlantis, the text is not entirely clear on this point. If the impact that led to the destruction of Atlantis was of a magnitude comparable to that associated with the Berkel crater about 6,600 years later, it would almost certainly have affected a wide area, encompassing Athens and most of the Mediterranean. Based on contemporaneous factors to be covered in due course, its magnitude would appear to have been greater still. Sonchis of Sais refers to it in light of, quote, the extraordinary inundation, end quote. Note Sonchis' use of the word "the," but reminds us that many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years. It is not certain, therefore, that the deluge that blocked off Atlantis with a shoal of mud is also one of those that Sonchis assures us nevertheless washed another layer of Athenian topsoil into the Mediterranean Sea. As we shall explore further in due course, we are given to understand from Plato, according to Sonchis of Sais as told to Solon and subsequently reported by Critias at Socrates' symposium, that, quote, in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men, that is, of Athens, in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea, end quote. Unfortunately, this text omits the location of the Athenian forces at the time of their demise. The Wikipedia article on Atlantis, at the time this video was posted, according to which it was a fictional island mentioned in an allegory on the hubris of nations, both reflects and perpetuates a widespread dismissal of this story as a vacuous fairy tale devoid of historicity. But there is a fatal flaw in this view. Sonchis of Sais tells us that all your warlike men and the island of Atlantis in like manner were both destroyed by the same event. This causes the interpretation of Plato's Atlantis as an allegory on the hubris of nations to unravel before our eyes. Calamity is not much of a morality lesson when it befalls both sides in a conflict. Plato's Atlantis breaks down as a morality lesson for the simplest of reasons. It is not a morality lesson. It's a lightly fragmented historical account that we are lucky to have received at all, and is not without a measure of scientific resonance and detail which, even by Plato, the teacher of Aristotle, who planted the seeds of modern science, would have been all but impossible to invent some 2,400 years ago. So, where in this question lies the real absurdity? In our suspension of disbelief in the writings of Plato? In the idea that Critias would have had to concoct a fictional account of events in the remote past of Socrates' gathering in order to present to them a morality lesson in collective hubris? Or in the idea that Critias, after all of that effort in constructing such a detailed fictional story, a fictional story whose incidental details resonate inexplicably with modern scientific knowledge, would have thus concocted an ultimately ambiguous morality lesson and passed it off more than once as a truthful account. Surely this sort of contribution would not have fit in with Timaeus's lengthy treatise on the nature of things, according to the latest scientific knowledge of his day. It would not, in other words, have been welcomed as such at Socrates' symposium. The story we do get from Critias, by contrast, as recorded by Plato, fits most commendably. If it's our reputations that hold us back, then let's put them aside for the sake of analysis and follow the clues that Plato left to us through the person of Critias, who has described in both mythical and scientifically recognizable form such cataclysmic natural disasters through the ages as we either experience firsthand or narrowly miss on a regular basis today. The only difference today is our understanding and awareness of these near misses and of every volcanic or seismic catastrophe the world over, no matter how distant they may seem to those of us fortunate enough to have been thus far spared their impartial ravages. Atlantis, Part 3. Orientation. The Egyptian priest, Sonchis of Sais, continues his account to Solon. For these histories tell of a mighty power which, unprovoked, made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city, Athens, put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island, situated in front of the straits which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles, and the island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea which is within the Straits of Heracles is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Plato's Atlantis is a written record of a story told to a 10-year-old Critias by his 90-year-old grandfather, and recounted in adulthood at Socrates' gathering, based on a transcript that was still in his possession. It tells of the Greek statesman Solon's meeting with an elderly Egyptian priest with direct access to Egypt's historical archives as they existed at the time. By inference, according to Sonchis, either the Atlantis story in particular or the archives in which it was then kept, or both, had been curated, copied, recopied, and conserved over the 9,000 years since the time of the events it describes. Although there is much room for fluidity and decay in this putative succession of retellings, Critias the Younger's rendition, as written down by Plato, seems resolute and unambiguous, except in the location of Atlantis. Problems are not encountered until attempts are made to reconcile his account with the geography we get, by running the clock 9,000 years backward from Socrates, and with it the end of the last ice age, changes in sea level, and geological activity. These factors matter because there is no ready accounting in modern geological interpretation for the seismic or geophysical subsidence of a vast island continent just outside the Pillars of Heracles during the past 12,000 years. The Azores Plateau is foremost among the commonly proposed candidates for consideration as a physical remnant closely matching Critias' account of the location of Atlantis. Its geological history is well understood, however, and doesn't add up to the literal interpretation of his story. Most of it lies under too much water to have been an island continent within the past 12,000 years. It helps in addressing this dilemma to appreciate Critias' story as an amalgam of recollections that lacked in its retelling the benefit of modern cartographic technology. That said, his enthusiasm and desire for accuracy and detail will soon become obvious. We must also grapple with the possibility that no Athenian or Egyptian involved in the recording of events 9,000 years before Socrates ever traveled to this place called Atlantis. Such a lapse in direct experience would have left open the possibility that the geographical elements of the story are fragmentary, like the scenes in a half-remembered dream, covering, in fleeting glimpses, a wide and discontinuous swath of the territory ranged by this enigmatic extra-Mediterranean power. While there is no good candidate remnant matching Critias's positioning of Atlantis, there is an excellent candidate matching his more detailed description of the putative city and its surroundings, which we shall cover most thoroughly in due course. The astronauts call it the Eye of the Sahara, and it is known amongst modern Atlantis hunters as the Richat structure. While changes in sea level over the past 12,000 years cannot make the raised portions of the Richat structure into islands that long ago, running in reverse the precession of the equinoxes and the desertification of North Africa arising from the resulting changes in the Saharan climate can make islands of these features that long ago. Nor are the ancient inhabitants of North Africa silent on the matter of life in this greener Sahara. Atlantis, Part 4. The Search Narrows. The Egyptian priest continues his account to Solon about the fate of Atlantis at some point after the Athenians defeated the Atlanteans. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. What Sonchis of Sais makes clear is that the Athenian warriors sank into the earth, and Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea on the same day. What he doesn't mention is the location of the Athenian warriors at the time of their demise. As mentioned previously, it's unclear from this statement whether Sonchis of Sais meant that the Athenian warriors sank with Atlantis as an attacking or occupying force, or that Athens was affected by the same event. On the one hand, he gives us the impression, in describing these events in the same narrative without differentiating them, that the earthquakes, floods, and deluges affected both Athens and the Nile Delta, as well as Atlantis. On the other, it's only the Athenian warriors who sank into the earth on that day, suggesting that they did in fact perish as an attacking or occupying force. In the latter case, Athens might not have been as severely affected by the event that destroyed Atlantis. Sonchis noted previously that Athens suffered recurring deluges of its own over the thousands of years covered in his account, and so could have been describing separate destruction events in a free-flowing narrative. Sonchis met with Solon out of hospitality and an eagerness to inform. We should not confuse this meeting with a venue for the delivery of a detailed report held to modern standards of precision and clarity. Such free-flowing narratives mark out a common pattern in ancient literature that we would do well not to label impetuously as fiction, especially as this narrative in particular, when teased apart from its mythological shrouding, begins to sort well with modern scientific review. Critias continues, "For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island." Here's where the idea that Critias recounted earlier, that Atlantis was, quote, "an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles," end quote, becomes problematic, unless we are to understand that the straits were completely blocked off by the cataclysm he describes. While the Straits of Heracles are known to have been blocked through slow geologic processes between 5.9 and 5.3 million years ago, no such blockage is known to have occurred anywhere near the time frame posed by Critias. If, as therefore seems more likely, Critias did not mean to say that the Straits of Heracles were blocked off by a shoal of mud, then what did he mean when he said that, quote, "the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable"? Surely the open ocean cannot be made impassable and impenetrable by the subsidence of an island. Might therefore the great power described by Critias have been situated not on an island in front of the straits, but in a place that could somehow have become confused with such an island some 11,400 years ago, or perhaps in the subsequent retelling of the Atlantis story? They must have been. Jumping briefly ahead to Critias' recounting of the Atlantis creation myth, almost 3/4 of the way through Plato's Critias, in which Poseidon constructs and populates the city of Atlantis, quote, "so that no man could get to the island," end quote. Sonchis lets slip that, quote, "for ships and voyages were not as yet." This refers to the small center island on which the citadel was built. Surrounding it with a moat was supposed to afford protection because ships and voyages were not as yet. So there we have it. Even if there was in fact an island somewhere in the wide Atlantic Ocean, matching Plato's description in all respects, and even were it to be named Atlantis at any time throughout history, in oral tradition, in literature, in motion pictures, on television, or in countless internet media, it could scarcely have been Plato's Atlantis because, even if only in myth, the Atlantis described by Plato was populated before the advent of ships and voyages. So much for the mid-Atlantic island hypothesis. In and amongst the livestock and other copious riches that their so-called island, quote, "brought forth fair and wondrous, and in infinite abundance," end quote, were elephants. Not just a few, but, quote, "a great number of elephants." Now, elephants and even mastodons may have ranged far beyond Africa in those days. We will soon have little reason to follow that thread, however, as we begin to match our leading candidate site to the written record. The 26,000-year precession of the equinoxes was in a different place on its cycle back then, and the Western Sahara was a very different place than what we find there today. In scientific discourse, it's called the African Humid Period. Given that an open ocean, such as the North Atlantic, cannot be made, quote, "impassable and impenetrable," end quote, by the subsidence of an island, what place otherwise matching Plato's description of Atlantis could somehow have become confused with such an island at the height of Atlantean power, or during the ensuing 12,000 years? Critias continues, "Atlantis, which, as I was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and when afterwards, sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean." This account of the demise of Atlantis tells of a truly giant island, greater in extent than Libya and Asia, as Critias described it, which should therefore be imagined as both containing and surrounding the much smaller concentric island rings making up the city and the citadel itself, whose comparatively modest dimensions Critias measures out for us in great detail. It also tells us that contrary to the popular modern view, Atlantis did not sink entirely after all, but instead, quote, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers, sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. It's becoming increasingly clear that Critias did not, in fact, know the full size and extent of the host island, only that it was, quote, larger than Libya and Asia put together, end quote. Bigger, perhaps, than he or any other curator of ancient records were able to see or measure. Before the advent of shipboard navigation equipment, such as quadrants, sextants, accurate sea charts, almanacs, timekeeping devices, and the solution of the longitude problem that depends on these inventions, ancient mariners would have been unable to determine, independently of known reference points, how far east or west they had ventured from their starting point. Even their latitude would be difficult to measure accurately without a table giving the sun's declination for the day. Encountering a landmass under these circumstances, and without compasses for reliable guidance, ancient mariners would have been unable to determine whether the landmass they had encountered was an island, a new continent, or something closer to home, upon which they had circled back. Africa today is considered a continent only by virtue of its size, and because the Suez Canal is an artifice that does not completely cut it off from Eurasia. Otherwise, like most other continents, it's just a huge island. One must bring up a world, well, atlas, if you'll pardon the irony, in order to adjudicate these fine distinctions today. So how were Plato, some 2,400 years ago, or the putative descendants of Atlas himself, some 11,400 years ago, supposed to have adjudicated them without the aid of such a heavenly vantage? The answer should be obvious. When ancient peoples describe geographical objects, be they water or land, we must take into account the limits of their geographical range, positioning accuracy, and observing capacity. We must also appreciate that the fine distinctions we make today between islands and continents would have been alien to them. When they describe a large island, we must understand that they have reached a consensus on that designation amongst themselves, over time, based on their limited observational criteria and expeditionary accounts, and that this consensus, whatever its origins, has nothing to do with modern definitions. Critias continues his contribution to Socrates' Symposium. Poseidon enclosed the hill in which she, Cleito, dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center. We already know that for ancient peoples, especially the Egyptians and Greeks, nothing exists except what the gods had some reason to create. So as we read these creation myths, we should keep in mind that they reflect assumptions in the absence of modern knowledge about how things came to be. If we read them as metaphors, as I secretly suspect many ancient peoples did, we'll be fine. Now let's have a look from the less exciting but more explanatory modern perspective based on material reductionism. According to the Wikipedia article on the Richat structure, quote, "The circular distribution of ridges and valleys is explained as the formation of suestas by the differential erosion of alternating hard and soft rock layers, uplifted as a dome by an underlying alkaline igneous complex of Cretaceous age. How's that for material reductionism? Also, according to the Wikipedia article, the Richat structure is the location of exceptional accumulations of Acheulean, that's proto-human, artifacts. The article goes on later, quote, artifacts are found, typically redeposited, deflated, or both, in late Pleistocene to early Holocene gravelly mud, muddy gravel, clayey sand, and silty sand, end quote. Tantalizing Atlantis hunters to the very end, the paragraph concludes with, quote, numerous concordant radiocarbon dates indicate that the bulk of these sediments accumulated between 15,000 and 8,000 years before present, during the African humid period. These deposits lie directly upon deeply eroded and weathered bedrock. Let's repeat those last two sentences from the Wikipedia quote. Numerous concordant radiocarbon dates indicate that the bulk of these sediments accumulated between 15,000 and 8,000 years before present, during the African humid period. These deposits lie directly upon deeply eroded and weathered bedrock. This lends hearty support to Plato's account of the large-scale deposition of mud, circa 11,400 years ago, over a surface previously exposed for a long period to water and weather. This long period of weathering and erosion of the underlying bedrock would have meant that the area was clear of mud and that the channels were filled with flowing water for use by the putative Atlantean civilization, up until the time of its destruction. This accords with both the paleoarchaeological record and with Plato's story of Atlantis. Although evidence supporting the presence of modern humans isn't mentioned in the Wikipedia article on the Richat structure, that covering the African humid period says, the African humid period led to a widespread settlement of the Sahara and the Arabian deserts, and had a profound effect on African cultures, such as the birth of the pharaonic civilization. In a Smithsonian Magazine article dated March 24, 2017, about conditions in the Sahara circa 10,000 years ago, author Lorraine Boissonneau writes, the now desiccated northern strip of Africa was once green and alive, pocked with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and even forests. While definitive maps of what this might have looked like in and around the Richat structure may not yet exist for lack of sufficient data, fanciful maps are easier to find out of an abundance of imagination. This one by concept artist Jean-Pic Lorenz looks less and less fanciful the more we learn about the African humid period. Atlantis, Part 5. Atlantis in detail and the Richat structure during the African humid period. A watery Richat structure is not inconsistent with the geological record, nor with modern conceptions of the African humid period. Here I've circled an area of the Western Sahara containing the Richat structure, on a map of Africa as it might have appeared at some point between 14,600 and 5,000 years ago. Critias continues his contribution to Socrates' symposium. Poseidon fell in love with her, Cleito, and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water. Myths can be metaphorical, but that does not make them fictional. The Richat structure has a well-understood geological history, but ancient peoples cannot be expected to have understood modern geology. In their minds, someone had to have made the Richat structure, and Poseidon was the best candidate god. What's important here are the details of the description that can help us to match the myth to the reality. We have not yet gotten to measurements, but one can easily see in this description a qualitative match to the Richat structure, based on any good topographic image, assuming the presence of enough water during the African humid period to fill the circular channels, and that most of the sediments filling them now were deposited later. Both of these assumptions find support not only in the writings of Plato, but in the present-day geological, archaeological, and climatological records as well. Deeply eroded and weathered bedrock, as described in the Wikipedia article cited previously, indicates that the bedrock was exposed and clear of sediments for an extended period before those sediments were deposited between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago. The Egyptian archives, as recounted by Sonchis of Sais, indicate that Atlantis was connected to the Atlantic Ocean by a navigable waterway. While the climatological and geological records associated with the Richat structure and its surroundings may one day lend support to this part of the story, Sonchis tells us that the people of the Atlantean civilization were not passive players in ensuring this. As might any people desiring security and prosperity in an environment as rich in natural resources as it may also have been in competition for those resources, they would have had ample economic incentives to build their society from within the natural protection of a triple-moded geological feature with access to the Atlantic Ocean. According to Plato, they made effective use of these features for economic gain. In short, they were motivated to modify their geological surroundings, and did so, according to Sonchis, quote, by the labors of many generations of kings through long ages, end quote, using resources, quote, in infinite abundance. Then, as now, protective geological barriers allow societies to develop and grow beyond the reach of aggressive competitors. This principle underlies the success of innumerable societies throughout history, from the Nile and Indus valleys to the Cycladic and Minoan civilizations of the Mediterranean, to the Fertile Crescent, to the Italian peninsula that protected the administrative core of the Western Roman Empire for 871 years, to the sprawling success of the British Empire in the post-Enlightenment era, to the present-day dominance of the United States with vast oceans to the east and west, and friendly settled neighbors to the north and south. Even the warlike Spartans, who eschewed fortifications as a sign of weakness, thrived in a fertile valley protected by precipitous mountains, a precipitous coastline, and precipitous navy-swallowing gulfs, serving as its gateways to the Mediterranean. It was a geological arrangement that left them a lot of breathing room for huffing, puffing, and successful campaigning. Rah! Critias continues. He himself, Poseidon, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. We know that the Richat structure overlies sources of warm water. Per the introduction to the Wikipedia article, quote, igneous rock is exposed inside, and there are spectacular rhyolites and gabbros, which have undergone hydrothermal alteration, and a central megabrachia, end quote. The historical presence of hydrothermal activity significantly narrows our geographical search for Plato's Atlantis, without excluding the Richat structure. Critias continues. to his twin brother, who was born after him, after Atlas, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island towards the Pillars of Heracles, facing the country which is now called the region of Gades, which corresponds to modern-day Cadiz, Spain, in that part of the world. All these and their descendants, for many generations, were the inhabitants and rulers of divers islands in the open sea. And also, as has been already said, they held sway in our direction over the country within the Pillars, as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. These passages first yank us back to the conception of Atlantis as a large island, not far outside the Pillars of Heracles, Gibraltar on this map, and then conflate, quote, the island, end quote, with, quote, diverse islands in the open sea, end quote, which could have included, for example, the Canary Islands. These lie about midway between the Richat structure's geological interface to the Atlantic Ocean, just north of modern-day Nouakchott, the capital city of Mauritania, and the Straits of Heracles. Additional evidence against the mid-oceanic island hypothesis for Atlantis, and in support of a captive, littoral, inland location soon follows. Critias continues. There was an abundance of wood for carpenter's work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island. For as there was provision for all other sorts of animals, both for those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those which live in mountains and on plains, so there was for the animal which is the largest and most voracious of all. Fauna in such numbers, size, and variety would quickly deplete the limited resources of all but the very largest and resource-rich of islands. As noted before, ancient peoples had no reason to draw the fine geographical distinctions that we draw today between islands and continents. Once again, the presence of, quote, a great number of elephants, end quote, draws us inexorably back to Africa. Atlantis, Part 6. Measurements. The city proper. Critias continues his contribution to Socrates' symposium. And beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth, and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. The only inconsistency between this and what follows is the definition of the sea. In this case, it appears to mean the inland extent of the channel, leading from the Atlantic Ocean up to the city. In the following, it appears to mean the Atlantic Ocean proper. We must remind ourselves here and elsewhere that the ancient chroniclers are not bound by modern definitions in their choice of words. The Roman common stadium converts to 184 meters. In this image, I overlay a radius of 50 stadia onto the Richat structure, which fits rather nicely to the outermost extent of the outermost ring structure. In the passage, however, the 50 stadia appears to refer to the length of the canal leading up from without to the outermost ring structure, to wit, and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone. Now, the largest of the zones into which a passage was cut from the sea, continues Critias, was 3 stadia in breadth, and the zone of land which came next of equal breadth. But the next 2 zones, the one of water, the other of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. I've illustrated this dimension as a radius so that we can see where the center of the Richat structure lies. Just slide the red line to the northeast by half its length, and it will span the width of what Sonchis tells us was once the central island. Thus, according to our only source on Atlantis, quote, the island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. The stone, which was used in the work, they quarried from underneath the center island, and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side. As noted earlier in the Wikipedia article, quote, igneous rock is exposed inside, and there are spectacular rhyolites and gabbros, which have undergone hydrothermal alteration and a central megabrachia. Per Wikipedia, a brachia is, quote, a sedimentary rock composed of broken fragments of minerals or rocks, cemented together by a fine-grained matrix that can be similar to or different from the composition of the fragments. With this base definition in mind, a megabrachia is, quote, a breccia composed of very large rock fragments, sometimes kilometers across, which can be formed by landslides, impact events, or caldera collapse. Leaving the palace and passing out across the 3 harbors, continues Critias, you came to a wall which began at the sea and went all round. This was everywhere distant 50 stadia from the largest zone or harbor, and enclosed the whole, the ends meeting at the mouth of the channel which led to the sea. Critias again describes an outer radius, the additional 50 stadia, or 9.2 kilometers, from the city center, demarcating in polar coordinates an outer circular zone about the city. Beyond the 50 stadia inner radius of the outermost circular channel, this enclosing zone fills out the circular portion of the Richat structure as it appears today. This was everywhere distant 50 stadia from the largest zone or harbor, Critias stated, and enclosed the whole, the ends meeting at the mouth of the channel which led to the sea. Atlantis, Part 7. Measurements, the surrounding area. Critias continues his contribution to Socrates' symposium. The whole country was said by him to be very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia. That's 552 kilometers. It was smooth and even, Critias tells us, and of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia. Let's just look at this chart a while longer, minding the numbers. Let's also recall the description and measurements of the Richat structure, which fit just as cleanly Critias' description of the city proper. With all this in mind, let's sit back and contemplate the probability that Sonchis was describing some other place. But across the center inland it was 2,000 stadia, which is 368 kilometers. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. The surrounding mountains were celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond any which still exist. In terms of the present topology, it's hard to know what Critias meant to measure in the 2,000 stadia breadth dimension. Those details may have been lost when the present-day layer of mud was deposited, or more likely when, quote, "a single night of excessive rain," end quote, turned everything into mud. Until some time after the purported deluge ended, this mud would then have slid into the navigable waterway leading to the sea, filling it up and blocking it for the next 11,400 years. I will now describe the plain, continues Critias, as it was fashioned by nature, and by the labors of many generations of kings through long ages. It was, for the most part, rectangular and oblong, and where falling out of the straight line followed the circular ditch. As will be shown, Critias is talking here about the area to the northeast of the Richat structure, what Sonchis called the plain. What remains of the Richat structure and its immediate surrounds, however, is a compelling match to this description, but also a source of confusion. The depth and width and length of this ditch were incredible, continues Critias, and gave the impression that a work of such extent, in addition to so many others, could never have been artificial. Nevertheless, I must say what I was told. It was excavated to the depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. It was carried round the whole of the plain, and was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and, winding round the plain and meeting at the city, was there led off into the sea. We need not suppose that this encompassing watercourse transport ditch that Critias describes was precisely circular, as he also describes it as winding. Geometric precision would have served no practical purpose, nor indeed any aesthetic purpose, but to the unblinking heavens above. As mentioned before, a modern remnant of what Sonchis describes here may have been lost when the present-day layer of mud was deposited. Critias goes on to describe additional canals feeding into this main ditch, explaining that the network of waterways thus created was used to transport natural resources from the surrounding area down to the city. He follows this with a narrative on the structure of Atlantean society and politics, leading up to the end of the apparently incomplete document. Here's where we get another payback for giving Plato the benefit of the doubt. An explanation emerges from this chart, quite unexpectedly, for why Sonchis told Solon that the island of Atlantis, quote, disappeared in the depths of the sea, end quote. As discussed previously, this statement, on its face, appears to stand at odds with the concurrent assertion that Atlantis, quote, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean, end quote. To resolve this apparent contradiction, we need an explanation that satisfies both of these assertions. The deluge that followed the immediate effects of the bolide impact would have overflowed, in its first few hours, the transport channel leading down to the city, that is, to the island of Atlantis in Sonchis' meaning, which in turn would have raised the water levels catastrophically, thus inundating the city and the surrounding area. This in turn would have created a temporary flood zone and a cataclysmic runoff channel, that would have washed all in its path down toward the Atlantic Ocean, leaving in the aftermath, as Sonchis put it, an impassable barrier of mud and a shoal of mud in the way. This shoal of mud would thus have replaced what was, before the destruction, the navigable channel of earlier renown. This surprise revelation vindicates the idea expressed earlier of taking Plato at his word, of giving him the benefit of the doubt for the sake of analysis, of confronting his account steadfastly, and examining the ramifications of every detail. When everything gels on close examination, it's another indication of something real behind the myth. While we're here, let's step back from what we're looking at for a broader perspective. I'm not the only one who sees it. For me, it's been eye-catching from the very beginning. An unmistakable west-southwest to east-northeast streaking of the desert terrain on a massive scale, as though something had slammed into the Atlantic Ocean and made a formidable splash that left its mark across the major portion of this part of the African continent. Following the descending terrain described by Critias, the mud shoal thus created, and in the deluge and inundation of the metropolis that followed, can almost be seen then sliding back down from east-northeast to west-southwest in the aftermath of the impact. Suppose now that we want to reduce this concept to its simplest form. What would a complete idiot like me do to find out where the bolide hit? Now, supposing a bolide did hit this region about 11,400 years ago, coincident with the timeline of Critias' story about the destruction of Atlantis. How big was it, and in how many pieces? What was the angle of incidence? Was it an asteroid, a comet, or something in between, a dirty snowball, as they call the various hybrid species? If a bolide or fragment did strike this area with a high kinetic energy but wasn't that big, or exploded before impact, we might expect a big splash but not necessarily a big crater. Then again, perhaps a remnant of the impact can be found in the geology of the Cape Verde Islands, subject, of course, to what is understood about this area today. But before we move on, isn't there something circular around where the lines meet? I didn't even see this myself until I started proofing the charts and zoomed out on this one for a wider perspective. I just asked myself what a complete idiot would do and extended the lines until they met. As you can see, the lines meet at a point slightly southwest of the center of this circularity, right where I left them. It could also be that I'm reading too much into the streaking of the desert terrain, that it follows only the mudslide fall lines and not the radial lines of the bolide impact, or that it traces the climbing path of the tsunamis, for example, that would have inevitably followed such an impact. Aside from this, there's one small thing to notice before we move on. I learned about so-called splosh craters in The Surface of Mars by Michael H. Carr, 2007, while researching a journal article. These are the, shall we say, mud splash remnants of impacts into a surface containing enough water or ice, which on Mars is melted by the heat of impact, to modify the pattern of ejected material from the simpler form seen in dry sand or rubble, such as in lunar craters, or in the case, for example, of Barringer Crater in Arizona. Do you see the difference? We could speculate that this splosh crater resulted from a secondary impact, or from the impact of a smaller fragment of the bolide that destroyed Atlantis. But we can't say much more about this Mauritanian splosh crater without knowing when it was formed, except that the ground was more or less muddy at the time of impact. I'll leave it as an exercise for you to find the others. Atlantis, Part 8. Disorientation. We have one loose end to tie up before this ship will sail. Except for the close match in its description, as interpreted to allow for geological and climatological changes since the African humid period, how, in the geographic sense, could the Richat structure and its surroundings have become confused with an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we now know did not actually exist? The Wikipedia article on the vertical Canary Current provides an answer. Keep in mind from Part 4 that people in prehistory almost certainly lacked the navigational prowess to determine their longitude, or even very accurately their latitude, independently of known reference points. Ships heading west out of the Mediterranean would have been directly opposed by the westerly Azores winds, and diverted southwestward by the northern trade winds, away from and, we might expect, out of sight of the West African coast. Into the vertical Canary Current. When caught in due course by the vertical Canary Current, hapless ancient vessels would have then been turned southward until catching sight of land again, somewhere along the jutting peninsula between Depeche de Lamhiris and La Guera in modern-day Western Sahara. Rounding this jutland back eastward toward the African coast would have brought them straight into the waterway that Critias tells us connected Atlantis to the Atlantic Ocean, until, as Critias tells us, when afterwards, sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers, sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. According to the Wikipedia article on the Canary Current, quote, "This wide and slow-moving current is thought to have been exploited in the early Phoenician navigation and settlement along the coast of western Morocco." End quote. Although the historical record of the Phoenicians, for all we know a remnant of Plato's Atlanteans or of their trading partners still set in their ways 7,500 years on, dates far more recently, their use of the Canary Current illustrates its effect on early ships and sailors of any era venturing out from the Mediterranean. The Azores winds, the northern trade winds, and the vertical Canary Current have not changed in the past 12,000 years, as they are driven by Coriolis forces linked to the rotation of the Earth. There can be little doubt, based on the geography and on Plato's text, that the Canary Islands would have been used as waypoints in both directions between Atlantis and the Pillars of Heracles in ancient times. The African coast is not visible at sea level from Punta La Entelada, the closest point on the closest island of Fuerteventura. Even today, there are, at best, only reports that Africa may be visible from Pico de la Zarza, the highest point. The Canary Islands, when used as waypoints, thus guarantee that Mediterranean voyagers traveling to and from Atlantis would lose sight of the African continent along the way. The experience of those making this voyage during the African humid period, without modern navigational tools, would therefore have been one of sailing out through the Straits of Heracles, by way of the Canary Islands, to, as Critias described it, an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and into the putative ancient waterway leading to Atlantis. If there is a morality lesson here, it will be for those who survive the next global catastrophe. Their lesson will not be played out in a fictional account. It will be played out by this generation, and the next, and the next, by those who saw the ancient chronicles and dismissed them, or who saw them but didn't understand them, or who understood them but didn't do anything to prevent what they foretold, and what modern science confirms is inevitable, as Sonchis put it, after the usual interval. Unlike the ancients, an Earth-crossing object is well within our capability to understand and deflect. Therefore, we don't have the excuses they had, nor need we remain powerless over the fate of our species. Or perhaps if the catastrophe is big enough, those who survive it will begin all over again, like children, as Sonchis told Solon, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among themselves. There is a political Goldilocks zone of impact severity, within which the catastrophe is big enough to engender sustainable proactive preventive measures, but not big enough to set humanity back so far that preventive measures are once again out of reach. Good luck hitting that zone. In the end, human beings are reactive by nature, not proactive. It's worth repeating at this juncture that Plato's Atlantis breaks down as a morality lesson for the simplest of reasons. It's not a morality lesson. It's a lightly fragmented historical account that we are lucky to have received at all, and is not without a measure of scientific resonance and detail, which, even by Plato, the teacher of Aristotle, who planted the seeds of modern science, would have been all but impossible to invent some 2,400 years ago. In fairness to present efforts, which we shall cover in much greater detail in the next part, this NASA page states, "The Double Asteroid Redirection Test Mission is a planetary defense-driven test of technologies for preventing an impact of Earth by a hazardous asteroid. DART will be the first demonstration of the kinetic impactor technique to change the motion of an asteroid in space." Atlantis, Part 9. Interception. Speaking from the context of a limited budget, today's experts have identified detection as step 1 in the interception and deflection of Earth-crossing objects. There is a serious flaw in this arrangement. Step 1 cannot be detection. By the time a new Earth-crossing asteroid or comet on the final leg of its journey toward impact is detected, it will be too late to formulate and implement an interception and deflection plan from scratch. Therefore, detection is step 2 and interception is step 3. Step 1 is the establishment of a large-scale, heterogeneous, and massively redundant rapid response Earth-crossing object interception and deflection system. A system that's maintained, improved, and scaled up in perpetuity, standing ready today, tomorrow, and forevermore for any sort of major Earth-crossing object. Of concern to deflection programs are Earth-crossing objects, ECOs. These include any object whose orbit or trajectory will at some point in the future intersect Earth. Near-Earth objects, NEOs by contrast, have orbits that frequently bring them into proximity with the Earth, but may never intersect Earth orbit at just the right place and time to result in an impact. Not all near-Earth objects are Earth-crossing objects. This is a good thing. Many NEOs have orbits that have been projected well into the future and are known to have a low risk of ever hitting the Earth. More importantly to deflection programs, and not a good thing, is that not all Earth-crossing objects are near-Earth objects that we can easily track. The worst kind of ECOs are long-period comets from the Oort cloud, which spend the vast majority of their life cycles where we can't see them. Not seeing them, we cannot identify, observe, or track them. By the time a previously unknown comet comes close enough for us to detect it on the last and fastest leg of its orbit, it will be too late with present technology to prepare an interception and deflection mission from scratch. As evidenced by the European Space Agency's Rosetta mission in 2015, comets and asteroids come in all shapes, sizes, and compositions. Some ECOs may not arrive all in one piece. They could arrive as a so-called flying rubble pile, bound loosely by gravitation, or as a rapidly sublimating comet or dirty snowball that breaks apart on its final inbound leg through interaction with the intensifying heat and plasma streams it encounters in close proximity to the Sun. For single rocky objects without natural sublimation jets strong enough to interfere with a delicate two-body dance, the gravity tractor concept might suggest an optimal mission design. According to the Wikipedia article, the Asteroid Redirect Mission Vehicle was conceived to demonstrate the gravity tractor planetary defense technique on a hazardous size asteroid. The gravity tractor method leverages the mass of the spacecraft to impart a force on the asteroid, slowly altering the asteroid's trajectory. Also for single rocky objects, V.P. Vasiliev proposed a mirrored collector called the Ring Array Concentrator. This type of collector has an underside focal area that avoids shadowing of the collector by the target and minimizes the risk of it being coated by ejected debris. Concentrating sunlight on a specific point on the object produces a surface irradiance leading to a thrusting effect. This may be sufficient to deflect a half-kilometer asteroid over the course of several months, without an additional warning period, using a ring array collector about half the diameter of the asteroid. A kinetic interceptor mission would not be effective on a flying rubble pile, for example, nor might a gravity attractor, solar sail, or ring array concentrator mission be the best choice for a massive, monolithic, carbonaceous chondrite without adequate notice. Nuclear standoff deflection may be the only effective strategy for large planet-killer asteroids over 1 kilometer in diameter, and for massive so-called flying rubble piles with too many large pieces to be deflected individually. Blast deflection could also be used in a backup mission to follow one or more unsuccessful attempts using alternative methods. A NASA study from 2007 concluded that nuclear standoff explosions were likely to be the most effective method for diverting an approaching Earth-crossing object. In the first analysis, a fully mature response system would meet any Earth crosser with a mission tailored to the characteristics of the threat object or objects, selected quickly from a library of such missions, prepared and made ready in advance. On second thought, this two-phase response profile will never be optimal. Precious time would be lost in characterizing the threat object, which, moreover, may require a preliminary reconnaissance mission. And if the right deflection mission is not yet ready, more time still would be lost in building and/or preparing it for launch. Not to mention the additional time it would take to reach and intercept the threat object. Fortunately for results-oriented mission designers who may not have unlimited time and budget, nature abounds in examples to follow that have been polished over untold eons of evolution. Nature doesn't design anything. Nature adapts. Solutions found in nature are what they are, not because someone thought that this or that system architecture might be a good idea. They are what they are, for better or worse, simply because what they are, in all that time, has been found to work. In the immune system, the innate response, polished over eons, having been found sufficient to attack and quell or mitigate a wide range of pathogenic microbes, is sent out immediately, while the adaptive responses are tailor-made for the invading antigen, and proliferate after encountering it and adapting their defenses to the specific structure of its active surface elements. Because they can be used effectively against a wide range of ECO types, a good candidate for the innate component of an ECO intercept mission would be a selection of nuclear standoff deflectors in a range of blast megaton specifications. If one deflector fails, or if the ECO trajectory thus modified proves unacceptable, another such device would come into play as a backup. Think of the adaptive responders, on the other hand, as a collection of gentler, more creative and innovative deflection systems. The Forrest Gump deflectors, if you will. 'Cause an Earth-crossing object's like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're gonna get. Think of a Swiss Army knife. The ideal ECO deflection system will have a core launch and intercept mission component, the innate response, applicable to the deflection of any ECO, and a wide range of specialized mission components, the adaptive response, each capable of deflecting a particular type of ECO at almost any point on its trajectory, before final impact. We can say this categorically as armchair astrophysicists because the need for such a system should be obvious. By extension, the advantages of a heterogeneous array of redundant backup systems made ready by competing organizations should also be obvious. Otherwise, there may be only one specialized mission component for the next big Earth-crossing object. If the one component doesn't work, and all of the applicable backup components are of the same design, and find themselves disabled in the 11th hour by the same failure mode, the entire effort will have come to naught. The immune system operates within a single organism. This allows a two-step response to work in a timely manner, since the supply lines to the infection site will always be short. In this environment, the innate response can be sent out immediately, while the adaptive response is constructing and proliferating an antigen-specific antibody to follow in due course, as soon as it's ready. In most ECO intercept missions, by contrast, where a rapid response is essential, the innate and adaptive components must be launched together or in quick succession. There will be no time to wait for the innate components to arrive at the object and return the data needed for the tailoring of the adaptive component, which must instead be capable of adapting itself at the scene, either autonomously or by ground-based commanding, at the relatively modest cost of a number of round-trip communication and analysis cycles. Did you ever call the fire department and wonder why they also sent an ambulance? Because they know that you may not know if there were injuries, or will be by the time the fire truck arrives. Everything has to arrive at once. We've learned it the hard way in that case, but can't afford to learn it the hard way in ECO deflection missions. Somewhere in the purview of this archival photo of the Allied landings at Normandy, there's a weapon for every target and a tool for every purpose. By a similar account, ECO intercept missions operating under threat of extinction-level events must send all or nothing and had better work the first time, or have enough backup missions lined up to cover the worst of the worst-case perfect storm of mission failures. Competing missions should not be far behind, each one developed independently, and each team hoping that their mission will be the first to arrive. Hopefully the mission with the best chance to succeed will not fail for having cut one too many corners for the sake of speed. The most infamous maiden voyage in that category was that of the HMS Titanic. The D-Day analogy fits in scale, but not in context. D-Day was prepared in reaction to foreign aggression. Ask the British, who had to fight and win the Battle of Britain on their own before the Allied forces came to their aid. An ECO intercept mission, by contrast to most other human endeavors, must be prepared proactively, in anticipation of an event we know to be inevitable, but which no one in the modern era has ever seen. To make matters worse, we also know that the usual interval, mentioned by Sonchis of Sais, may not fall due for another 1,000 years. The big problem with the complacency that might engender is that the bell might also toll for us tomorrow. A shadowy rock could spring up out of nowhere with just a few days' notice. Or a beautiful comet could appear from out of the abyss and hang in the sky for months, getting bigger and more beautiful each night, until one day it enters the atmosphere and becomes a sun-like object, following a non-sun-like trajectory, ending in an explosive fireball. The spectacle of 100 lifetimes, marking the end of hundreds of millions, and an untold setback in the human condition. Nobody knows, and most of us are occupied with more pressing matters. Such nebulous threats have no immediate substance for us to react to. They are not the sort of thing to spur humans into action. As to the Fermi paradox, I think we have a compelling solution. The Fermi paradox estimates the number of advanced civilizations within our galaxy using the Drake equation, and then asks, why is it so quiet out there? Maybe this is the proximal cause of that silence. The final exam that each spacefaring civilization must ultimately pass in a timely manner requires proaction after a slow emergence of threat awareness has crystallized. Yet human beings, and most alien beings by inference because, well, it is so quiet out there, are reactive by nature, not proactive. So we all end up waiting, minding our reputations in the sunshine of complacency, or minding our business in the bliss of ignorance, for a Goldilocks impact, severe enough to spur us into action, but not so severe as to hurl our ECO interception capability once again out of reach. Therefore, intelligent beings are as many as come into being, reduced by the abysmal probability of enough Goldilocks impacts to spur each one to action before a really big chunk of rock or ice knocks them out completely. QED. We've been very lucky since what Sonchis of Sais called the Great Destruction of Deucalion, circa 2900 BCE, which would have devastated emerging agrarian communities across a quarter or more of the globe, as tsunamis washed away East African, South Asian, Indonesian, and West Australian coastal communities. According to the known accounts, of which there are several and to which too little credence has been given, the ensuing fallout of vaporized seawater, possibly global in scope, caused persistent deluges and flooding across the known world. The impact event 6,000 years earlier that Egyptian records, according to Plato, associate with the destruction of Atlantis in North Africa, and apparently with what Sonchis of Sais called the extraordinary inundation in the Mediterranean, coincided with the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse 1b, circa 11,400 years ago. When combined with the results of modern research on many fronts, this trail of clues paints an increasingly clear picture of one or more extinction-level events circa 12,900 to 10,200 years ago, that coincided temporally with the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America, and with a genetic bottleneck in the human lineage. According to the written record that Plato handed down to us, contemporaneous events caused widespread earthquakes, inundations, and catastrophic rainfall across West Africa and the Mediterranean. As has been duly demonstrated, we have much more reason to examine this record seriously than to disregard it, for want of a scientific rigor that had only just begun to emerge, thanks to, very specifically, Plato's Academy. As traces of these past apocalyptic events begin to emerge from the geophysical, climatological, and paleobiological record, so does our test as a technological species. We won't be graded on a curve. It's pass or fail. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes, as Sonchis tells us, in languages clear, to me at least, as a rain-washed sky, and supported more each day, in any case, by modern science. Our readiness for this next Earth crosser will decide our fate more than any other. The interception of unfamiliar ECOs will require both agility and flexibility. Competition for glory and prizes amongst private and government enterprises alike is more likely to succeed than megalithic cooperative efforts, which are prone to bureaucratic gridlock, single-point failure modes, and inadequate redundancy. The Athenians of the classical era, who brought us the story of Atlantis, called this sort of healthy and mutually beneficial competition the good strife. A grand adventure awaits those of us ready, willing, and able to join in. That's the carrot, but let's not forget about the stick. A single night of excessive rain. Earthquakes. The extraordinary inundation. In short, a bad day for everyone. Now that we're a spacefaring species, let's not fall prey to neglect and intransigence, and end up solving the Fermi paradox by default, by accident, or because we just didn't do enough by the end of the next usual interval, lamented by Sonchis of Sais. No one's going to foot the bill for everyone on a long-shot gambit that the present interval ends 5 years from now. Anyone and everyone, on the other hand, is going to want in on an organized and fully funded race for the glory of 100 lifetimes. Atlantis Interception. Closing remarks. To find out why such progressive ECO interception measures have not yet been taken, you can do a thought experiment that engineers call root cause analysis. Start with the desired activity, in this case a proactive, sophisticated, and massively redundant ECO interception program. Then ask yourself why it's not being developed, and work your way backwards along the line of causal regress. Why isn't there a sophisticated and massively redundant ECO interception program? Because there's no funding for it. Why isn't there adequate funding? Because of the lack of awareness that it's a precondition for our long-term survival as a species, and because of, well, gridlock in Congress. Why is there a lack of awareness? Perhaps because of an unwillingness to recognize such a program as a precondition for our long-term survival as a species. Modern science has already overtaken Plato's Atlantis as a rational basis for such a program, yet modern government and industry have thus far done too little to undertake it. As you can plainly see, the need for a proactive ECO interception program is a front upon which I, for one, am personally deployed. Why is there gridlock in Congress? Now, here's where it gets crazy. Pun intended. Curiously enough, I'm personally deployed on this front as well. But that is a topic for another context. Our heads should already be spinning and our eyes blinded by sun-like objects following non-sun-like trajectories, our wits dumbstruck by multi-million megaton impact events that few would survive to tell of, our ears deafened by sonic booms and airburst thunderclaps, our bodies incinerated by heat pulses, shaken by earthquakes, cast upon by skyscraping walls of water, washed out to sea in apocalyptic deluges, and our minds crisscrossed with celestial objects, be they rocky, icy, or single-minded automatons speeding to intercept them. All of this, together with mind categories as an evolutionary equilibrium distribution, are simply too much to handle in a single presentation. If you'd like to support these lines of archaeological inquiry and planetary defense advocacy, just like, subscribe, and take your pick of the ways you can do so on the following screens. Thanks for watching.